He founded the Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech. Bud Robertson has done so much for the state of Virginia to bring a clear understanding of the Civil War. We're indebted to him, but I'm taking his time. Come on up, Bud.
Thank you so much, George. It's a real pleasure to be with you all tonight. Roanoke is sort of my second home. For 44 years, I lived up on the mountain in Blacksburg, and then would come down here to civilization fairly regularly. If you ever want to see a lack of non-synchronization, drive through the town of Blacksburg. There are, at last report, 14 stoplights on Main Street, and it is demonstrably possible to catch every one of them. But I deviate. I wanted to start on a more positive note, but it's good to be here, and I'm especially pleased that so many of you have a lasting interest in history, because history is in trouble in this country. It's not being taught. When it is being taught, it is not being taught well. It is being twisted and torn and all to pieces. I find without exception that political correctness people have one thing in common. They're all F students in history. They have no idea what they're talking about. And I will demonstrate that tonight. But I am concerned. I wonder, and I was sitting here tonight thinking about it, I wonder 100 years from now what the historians are going to say about this. Are they going to call it the age of idiocy? The age of hypocrisy? God knows what is involved here. And when I look for an answer, I keep going back to something Winston Churchill said many, many years ago. When the present begins arguing with the past, you will lose the future. And that's where we are. I'm doing a book now on Robert E. Lee. I've been working on it for 2 years before all this present nonsense began. And I'm hoping that it will be out in 2019. But I want to talk to you tonight on what did not happen at Appomattox. I've taken many bus tours and tour groups down there, and you always talk about the two generals coming together, what they did. But I think there's an even better story in what they did not do. And I want to develop that story for you, so bear with me. Spring comes late quite often here in Virginia, and such was the case in 1865. April 9th, Palm Sunday, dawned with a chill. The high that day would be 57. Overcast skies on this Palm Sunday promised rain the next day, which did come. For a week, two armies, one mighty, the other staggering, had headed west from Richmond. And at the sleepy village of Appomattox, the journey ended. The Union Army of the Potomac had surrounded the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. And a turning point in history was about to be made. The two opposing generals had met once casually 18 years earlier in the Mexican War. In background and career and temperament, Ulysses Grant and Robert Lee came from entirely different worlds. Lee belonged to a disappearing age. He was from an aristocratic Virginia family that had fallen on hard times. At 13, he became head of the family. And Lee spent his teenage years caring for a mother who was dying of tuberculosis. And because he was the youngest of three sons, Robert had nothing to inherit when his mother passed. So he chose West Point because his family could not afford to send him to a college. He entered West Point in 1825. He graduated with the highest possible honors in 1829. He did not have any demerits on his record, but you have to qualify that. At that time, you could work off demerits, but I'm not sure that Lee ever got any to start with. He graduated in 1829 as the adjutant of the Corps, the highest rank a cadet could have. And this high standing got him posted to the Engineer Corps, the Army's smallest and most elite branch. And the 32 years of military service that followed were unblemished. He had worked first on coastal fortifications, and Fort Pulaski near Savannah, Fort Monroe in Newport News, Fort Carroll in Maryland, Fort Hamilton in New York, all fell into the hand of Lee as it went along. His most daring feat, I think, as a young, blossoming engineer officer came in the mid-1830s when the Mississippi River started leaving St. Louis. Now, if you've ever been on the Mississippi River, and I do cruise lectures on it quite often, you know there's not a mile of straight stretch in that river. It zigzags, and it's always changing location. And the Mississippi was moving eastward away from St. Louis when citizens appealed to the Corps of Engineers. And Lee and a young lieutenant named Montgomery Meigs went out to St. Louis, and through a system of dikes and bridges and dams, Lee got the river turned back. He is the godfather of modern-day St. Louis, but no one would admit it, not today, in today's standards. And in the Mexican War, he served on the staff of General-in-Chief Winfield Scott. He was brevetted 3 times for bravery in that war. And in the course of the war, Winfield Scott called Lee the bravest soldier he had ever seen. And this was only the second man in history ever to hold a lieutenant general's commission, Winfield Scott. Lee was in charge of the detachment of 12 Marines who, in late 1859, put down a terrorist raid by a wild abolitionist named John Brown at Harper's Ferry. And then came secession and war. Aged General Winfield Scott was asked late in 1860, when things were beginning to get warlike. General Scott made this observation: if I were on my deathbed tomorrow and the President of the United States should tell me that a great battle was to be fought, and he asked my judgment as to the ability of a commander, I would say with my dying breath, let it be Robert E. Lee. The Virginian was, in fact, offered such a command. When war came in April 1861, Lee received a soldier's dream, the offer to take command of all the Union forces, to be in complete charge of the Army, the highest aspiration one could have. And Lee declined. And the political correctness nuts will tell you all sorts of reasons why, but they missed the point completely. He declined because he was a Virginian. Now let me explain that to you. When the Constitution of the United States was adopted in 1787, Virginia was 180 years old. In 1861, when war clouds boil over, the United States is 70 years old. It's not old enough to have wisdom, not old enough to have experience, not old enough to have a decent president for the last 50 years, if you look at those mediocrities who hold the White House all through the first half of the 19th century. The United States was 70 years old. But Lee's had been living in Virginia for 225 years. Virginia was Lee's home. And you look at the various documents of that time, and again, this is misconstrued by these brainless people. When you look at the simple statistics involved here, when Lee took his officer's oath, his oath said that he would protect and defend the United States against their enemies. Their, not its, their. State rights were still very much alive in 1861. And had Virginia remained with the Union, Robert E. Lee would have taken command of the Union Army. But when Lincoln made it clear that the Union forces would move across Virginia to put down what Lincoln called a rebellion in the Deep South. And if you look at the secession ordinance of Virginia, it never mentions slavery. What it talks about is a word called coercion. Now we use it today, coerce somebody into something or other, but it had a political meaning back then. Under the term coercion, no foreign enemy army, no foreign army could come across Virginia's border without the permission of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so when Lincoln proposed to send Union forces into Virginia to get at South Carolina and the others who had left Virginia, then Virginia has no choice. It's going to be invaded. This is an act of war. And Virginia goes to war. And thus, Lee resigns after 32 years in the military. And to a friend, he wrote on that April day of resignation, "I simply cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my country." Leaving the nation's army was heartbreaking. Leaving the army was heartbreaking for Lee. But devotion to duty, dedication to his family, patriotism toward his state were overwhelming. And you see, what's wrong with the cuckoos today is they try to look at the past through the lenses of the present. You can't do that. You have to look back and see what little they saw in the past. I'll give you an example. I'm a nice, easygoing guy, really I am. But there's nothing that will get my dander up quicker than some battle nut just saying, if Lee had done this at Gettysburg, the battle would have been different. Or if General Lee hadn't done that at Gettysburg, it would have come out differently. Let me tell you something. If Lee had had 150 years to think about it, I'll guarantee you he would have done some things differently at Gettysburg. You can't do that. But that's what they're trying to do now, and lift these people out of context. Lee would command the South's premier army for 3 years. In battle after battle, he used audacity against always superior enemy forces. He took great risks, did the unpredictable, gambled against the odds. Sometimes it failed. Malvern Hill and Gettysburg are examples. Sometimes it succeeded, such as Second Manassas, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness. Always Lee kept federal armies off balance, uncertain, fearful of making a mistake that he could exploit. No one disputed his brilliance in the field. His soldiers adored him. To them, he was Moss Robert, if you will, a second father. Now, Lee was the physical embodiment of an exceptional leader, tall, a little under 6 feet, which was very tall in those days, with a calm voice and dignity that commanded respect. He stood out in any crowd. He had the brown eyes of the Lees. The war changed his hair from brown to gray to white. Possessed of a fierce and violent temper, Lee deserves incredible applause for containing it. This man would go through battle after battle, month after month, year after year, with all these superior odds against him, and he held his temper in check. We know only 4 times did he lose his temper, in the war. And on 2 of those occasions, I sympathized with him. He saw soldiers abusing horses, and he loved animals, and he had to be restrained in one instance from attacking a soldier who was beating unmercifully a horse. By 1865, he was probably the most respected general in the world. The war was still going. But by then, the war had taken a heavy toll on the general. In March 1863, and this is lost on the uneducated, Lee suffered, and I've talked to many medical societies because Civil War medicine is sort of a specialty of mine. There is no question that in March 1863, Robert Lee suffered a massive heart attack. It wasn't just a little case of angina, pectoris or something. He had a major heart attack. And what did the surgeons of that day do for him? Nothing. The field of cardiology lay in the future. They simply put cold compresses on his forehead and kept him under with opiates, and he had to work his way out of it. But he never did. And when you read about Robert E. Lee, remember that from the days before Gettysburg and for the next 7 years, here is a man fighting heart problems, and I mean fighting heart problems by himself. No medication, no idea what to do. And this would bother me. Lee also was one of millions of soldiers in the Civil War who suffered from chronic diarrhea. It's certainly not embarrassing. Lee was a chronic sufferer, not an acute one. And he seemed to get even more chronic when battle approached. And so you put that cardiovascular problem in there, and then put diarrhea on top of it. And here was a man who was weak, really ill the last 2 years of the war. In fact, in the fighting around Petersburg, he was often seen riding in a carriage. He just could not go through the effort of riding his horse. Then, by 65, the war was going to end pretty soon. Grant had besieged Lee's army. He had taken away Lee's mobility, and the Confederate army was starving, freezing, falling apart in Petersburg that last winter. Now today, the modern popular view of Sam Grant is of the quintessential American, the hero of the Republic, the simple son of a leather tanner who entered West Point reluctantly, got his best grades in horsemanship, was driven from the army because of drinking problems, and failed at every business venture until he joined his father's small tannery. Grant was reduced to the ultimate indignity of having to live off his father with a wife and 2 children. And the Civil War became his great opportunity to make improvements, and he made the most of it, though his journey had its bumps. At his first engagement, Belmont, Missouri, in the autumn of '61, Grant almost got captured. The Union Navy and Confederate ineptitude gave him victories at Forts Henry and Donelson. But he again was acclaimed for victory there, and actually given his nickname of Unconditional Surrender Grant. He was not on the field for at least one major battle, that was Shiloh, and he slowly gained prominence in the West, while Union generals were falling before Robert E. Lee in the East. And in March of '64, Mr. Lincoln appointed Grant General-in-Chief of all Union forces in the field. And the new Lieutenant General decided to go after Lee with his Army of the Potomac, whose track record to date was not good. The 42-year-old Sam Grant hardly looked the part of a supreme commander. He was 5 feet 8 inches tall, and he weighed 135 pounds. That was the average size of a male in those days. He was never conscious of the condition of his clothing or the state of his beard. Grant was not impressive looking. He looked like the town bum. He struck one observer as, quote, an ordinary scrubby-looking man with a slightly seedy look, as if he was out of office and on half pay. Even a female in Washington society found a peculiar aloofness to Grant. In a crowd, she said, Grant always seemed to be alone. Alone except for the 14 cigars he smoked each day. And he would die in 1885 of lung cancer. Now, starting in June 1864, and for 10 bleeding months thereafter, Grant laid siege to Lee at Petersburg and Richmond. And summer became autumn, and the winter that followed was the coldest of the war. And spring slowly came, and the rains stopped, and the roads became passable. And on April 2nd, 1865, with everything in place, Grant launched an all-out attack on Lee's thin line at Petersburg. And Federals broke through the works at multiple points. And by nightfall, Lee was retreating westward with the hope of uniting with what was left of General Joseph Johnston's army retreating through North Carolina. Lee had no more than 30,000 soldiers, a third of the army he'd once led. Grant's 80,000 troops were pressuring Lee's rear and flanks relentlessly. A Confederate recalled in that retreat from Petersburg, "During the last days, attack came from every quarter, and the days and nights alike were spent in marching and fighting. There was no opportunity for sleep, and of food there was none. Suspense, despair, exposure, famine, and want of sleep caused men whose weak bodies could not sustain their dauntless souls to lie down on the roadside to avoid and await the coming of death from exhaustion." Union cavalry very quickly galloped in front of the Confederates, and they sealed off the remaining escape route. And on Sunday morning, April 9th, Lee was informed that the army was surrounded. The war was about to end. Lee, weakened by stress and lack of sleep, had a visitor early that morning, and now we're into what did not happen. The visitor was one of his best officers, 29-year-old General Porter Alexander, a Georgian who was his finest artillery leader. Alexander came to headquarters not for orders, but to make a dramatic request. "Don't surrender," Alexander urged Lee. "Instead, tell the soldiers to disperse. Let each man take to the hills and the byways with his rifle in his hand. And let's go into guerrilla warfare, and we'll kill and burn and loot and destroy. And we'll keep this up for as long as it takes for the Yankees to grow tired of it and quit. Your soldiers," Alexander told Lee, "will do anything for you. You're the only thing that's left in the Confederacy in which they have any faith. We can fight on. Just say the word." And Lee said it. "No. We must consider the country as a whole," General Lee said that saddest day of his life. "Fighting as bushwhackers or die-hard bands of irreconcilables would create a state of things in the South which it would take for years and years to recover. Union forces would slash across the length and breadth of the land for no one knows how long. And in the end," Lee said, "widespread destruction and ingrown hatred would make it impossible for there ever again to be a union of states." And General Alexander in his memoirs confessed, "General Lee had answered my suggestion from a plane so far above it that I was ashamed I ever made the request in the beginning." The unquenchable guerrilla warfare, Alexander warned, was perhaps the one thing which would have ruined America forever. Guerrilla warfare was the one thing that Federals like Sherman and Grant and Lincoln dreaded the most. The slow-burning uprising that goes on and on, desperate men using violence to provoke more violence, with generation after generation learning hatred and bitter fighting in back alley brawls. And all those civil wars usually end that way. The American conflict was not going to follow such a policy, because Robert E. Lee said so. And after his meeting with Alexander, Lee mounted his horse and looked at the masses of Union forces in his front. And he suddenly blurted, "How easily I could be rid of this and at rest. All I have to do is ride along the line for a little while, and all will be over." Lee quickly regained his composure after thinking of the possibility of a suicide. And with a sigh he declared, "But it is our duty to live. What will become of the women and children of the South if we're not here to protect them?" A message for a meeting with Grant passed through the lines, and thus the son of an Illinois leather maker would dictate surrender terms to the son of one of the most prominent families in American history. Grant also faced a dilemma that Palm Sunday. Yet he had done what no other general in the past 3 years had done. He had at last brought the gray fox to bear. He at last, among all the others who had tried, had a neck grip, a stranglehold on Robert E. Lee. or Grant could attack in full strength at Appomattox if he wished, knowing full well the Confederate Army was helpless. Union forces could attack and just destroy the Confederate Army, and history would record that the Army was destroyed. Or Grant could charge Lee with treason, send him away to be tried in Washington, D.C., and let the hanging be a public event. And nobody in history would doubt that. That's the way civil wars normally go. Or Grant could simply send all the Confederates into prison and send some of them to the gallows. The South was helpless to prevent whatever Grant determined to do. But Grant, like him or not, himself had known personal defeat for such much of his life. He could empathize with how Lee felt that Palm Sunday morning. And Grant, like Lee, had a sense of history and the judgments that come from the future. Grant wanted a victory that would turn into a lasting peace. Completely destroying Lee's army was not the means to such an end. They tell a story that, if it isn't true, it ought to be. A month earlier, President Lincoln visited Grant at his Petersburg headquarters, and the two men conferred on the forthcoming campaign. And as Lincoln was walking up the gangway of his boat to return to Washington, Grant, standing on the shore, puffing on a cigar, suddenly blurted out, "Mr. President, what do you want me to do with him when I catch him?" And Lincoln did not hesitate. He turned quickly and said, "Let him up easy. Let him up easy." And Grant understood what Lincoln was saying and why he said it. And so at that afternoon of April 9th, 1865, the two generals met in the home of Wilmer McLean. Poor old Wilmer, I mean, you talk about somebody just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was an Alexander businessman. He had married a widow who owned this huge estate at a place called Manassas Junction. And there in July 1861, the Civil War began, and they fought it all over the estate and destroyed it. And Wilmer said, "This is it. We're going to get out of here. We're going south somewhere as far away as we can, to the most remote place I can find, and just get away from this war." So he moved down to central Virginia to a little place called Appomattox, built a big home there. And poor old Wilmer, it was into his home that Lee and Grant came and met the afternoon of April 9th. Grant arrived muddy, scuffed vest, obviously hadn't shaved, recovering from a migraine headache. Lee, of course, immaculately dressed, wearing sash and sword. And Grant apologized for his appearance, saying it was not meant to be a discourtesy. He'd just been so occupied with the Union Army. And Grant that afternoon was more uncomfortable than Lee was, like an underling in the presence of a superior. In truth, Grant had the sensitivity of a man who had another man in his power and did not want to hurt him any more than he possibly could. It was an odd sight. Grant, the nobody from nowhere, playing the part of a gracious host, a warrior who for once wanted to soften the blow that he was about to fall. Grant opened with idle conversation, then anxiously noted that they really needed to discuss the possible surrender of the Confederate Army. And Lee was visibly surprised at the leniency of Grant's terms of surrender. Even today, they seem incompatible in the face of devastation following 4 years of the most destructive war this country has ever known. Grant offered the following: officers would retain their sidearms for peaceful purposes at home. Confederates with horses could keep their horses for the spring plowing that needed to start work on. Learning that Lee's army was half-starved, Grant immediately ordered 25,000 rations to be issued at once to Lee's forces. And then the clincher to it all was the final condition. Confederate soldiers would sign paroles, and they would go home, and as long as they obeyed the law, federal forces and authorities were not to interfere with their lives. There would be no retributions. There would be no atrocities after the fact. The Confederates could simply promise to behave themselves, and they were not to be molested in any way. And this shocked Lee. And he actually said, this will do much toward the reconciliation of our people. Copies of the agreement were then prepared, and at 3 p.m., the Civil War in Virginia was over. Lee walked out on the front porch of the McLean home and stopped at the top of the stairs. And he looked off into the distance, and 3 times he beat his fist into his left hand. What was he thinking? We'll never know. He then descended the steps and mounted his wonderful horse traveler, and he looked up, and Grant was standing on the steps, and all of his generals were standing up on the porch. And as Lee looked up at Grant, Grant removed his hat in surrender, in a compliment to Lee, and all the other Union officers removed their hat in this salute to the conquered Southerner. And Lee started back to his lines. As he did, cheering broke out in the Union lines. The words got out that Lee had surrendered. The war was over. And it was probably the moment in the Civil War when Grant got the angriest. He shouted out, "Stop that damn cheering. The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." But that was no way to stem the joy. The Federals learned the war was over. They were going home. It was like, as one Union soldier wrote, as if all the 4th of Julys had come together at that one moment. The air, he said, is black with hats and boots and coats and knapsacks. Soldiers fall on each other's necks, and they laugh and cry by turns. Huge lumbering men embrace and kiss like schoolgirls, so happy that the killing is done. By late afternoon, one of those very emotional moments so often lost in Civil War history, by late afternoon, Union bands all along the lines began playing songs. And the songs began with patriotic airs. But soon, one melody repeatedly was drifting up and down the lines by one band after another. It was a song for the future, based on the events of the present and their relativity to the past. Soldiers on both sides understood the new meaning to the age-old words. Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind, we'll take a cup of kindness yet to days of old lang syne. And a mile away, silent ranks of Confederates watched as Lee came into view. And this letter has never been published before. Young Edward Jones was a teenager from Richmond. He was in a Richmond battery. And he recorded the scene with these words. In the evening, a loud cheer is heard up on the right. Rushing to the road, we see General Lee, hat in hand, riding down toward us. A thunderous cheer seemed to shake the very earth. The old general rode with his head bare, and never did he look more noble than then. I tried to join the cheer, but after a faint success, my voice stuck in my throat, and I could not utter a word. He rode over to his headquarters, where many of us followed him, and with a trembling voice and a moist eye, he made public the terms of our surrender. He excused himself from saying more. The crowd pressed forward to shake hands with him, and now commenced the most affecting scene I ever witnessed. Officers high in rank seized his hands with tearful eyes, nor were they more welcome than weeping privates, each of whom could feel the painful separation. And the old general stood with tears in his eyes and welcomed them one by one. And it seemed as a gray-headed father taking a last farewell of his children. I never witnessed such devotion. I found myself sobbing like a child. Pitifully little was left to the Army of Northern Virginia. Jackson's famous Stonewall Brigade, for example, had been contained in all some 6,000 soldiers in the course of the war. At Appomattox, it numbered 210 men, none above the rank of captain. Over 1,300 men had served in Richmond's 21st Virginia Infantry, left to surrender with 2 surgeons, a chaplain, and 40 enlisted men. Billy Yanks were aware that they had conquered what was left of a proud army. And not surprisingly, thereafter, Grant and Lee went on opposite directions in those post-war years. So potent was Grant's stature as a war hero that, like Dwight Eisenhower in the next century, he could have received the presidential nomination from either party. Grant, however, had never voted in his life, and he had no idea what was different between Democrats and Republicans. So it chose the Republicans simply because it was Lincoln's party and the party in power. And Grant easily won election, not once, but twice. Historians generally regard Grant's 8 long years in Blunderland as a national disgrace. The horse-loving general had no political horse sense, no grasp of politics, so to comprehension of the duties of the high office given him by grateful citizens. Grant was always impressed by wealthy men, so he appointed a half-dozen millionaires in a crazy quilt cabinet, soon covered in webs of scandals. Grant stood fiercely and ignorantly behind those fawning friends. And as President of the United States, Sam Grant almost deserves our sympathy. He seemed incapable of knowing that our presidency was far too big for him and that he had bungled it. Having little interest in politics and less interest in learning anything about politics, he left the nation in the hands of party bosses. Following his presidential years, Grant made some bad investments. And before long, he and his family were penniless. It was then that Mark Twain came forward to the rescue by offering Grant 75% royalties if he would write his memoirs. Meanwhile, Grant had suffered from a sore throat that got progressively worse and was finally diagnosed as inoperable cancer. And so a race began to complete the memoirs before the cancer took him. And in those last weeks, and especially in the summer of 1885 when the heat was so oppressive, we have photographs of Grant sitting in a chair, bundled up in blankets, trying to write his memoirs, complete his memoirs with pencil and paper. He could no longer speak, so he could not dictate. And the last chapter he wrote in longhand. He completed the manuscript 7 days before his death in July 1885. Over his tomb in New York City is the only memorable quotation U.S. Grant ever made. And he said it in 1865, "Let us have peace." Robert Lee faced the post-war years in defeat, humiliation, and uncertainty. He was penniless, homeless, and in ill health. Still, and despite his brilliance as a field commander, his most lasting achievement lay ahead, not behind him as a general of an army. Lee knew that the eyes of the public were upon him, and that if he wanted to continue this war, all he had to do was make an state an obscenity, make a curse, do something foul to show his dissatisfaction, and 5 million Southerners would rise up again. He knew that was possible. He wouldn't do it. He became a model. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that no man in America between 1865 and 1870 worked harder, more dedicatedly to bring North and South back together again than Robert E. Lee. He devoted the last 5 suffering years to bringing North and South back into a new union. And in 1868, his accomplishments had been such that Henry Ward Beecher, the leading abolitionist of his day, publicly praised Lee. The New York Herald, one of the nation's largest newspapers, endorsed Lee in 1868, 3 years after Appomattox, in the first national election following the war. The New York Herald endorsed Lee for President of the United States, claiming he was the one man that had done most to save the Union. Serve. His amnesty had never been signed. he was not an American citizen. Now, to carry that forward to a little footnote, in 1975, 105 years later, the amnesty application was discovered in a bundle of papers belonging to the State Department. There was speculation how they got there, and so be that as it may. On August 5th, 1975, President Joe Ford signed Robert Lee's amnesty, and he posthumously became an American citizen again. Enough to break your heart to see something like that occur. For a soldier who became a president of a college, what Lee did at Washington College, the little school in Lexington, was absolutely amazing. He revamped the curriculum. First time in America anyone had revamped a college curriculum. He did away with Latin and ancient Greek and old European theology and ancient history. Instead, he put in what he thought was a more fitting curriculum for the students who came to that school. Mathematics, American history, grammar, physics, basics of engineering, the kind of curriculum that would help a student. And Lee became so concerned about each student's course that he felt a student should have an opportunity to pursue his academic dreams the way he wanted to. So what did General Lee do? He introduced elective courses. And every one of you, and who went to college, had your choice of electives you could take. That came from a general, not from some high-ranking educator. And he made it a point, too, to know every student at the college. And once a year, he would write to the students' parents and give them a report on what the student had done that year. He took the job in October 1865 with 49 students and 4 faculty. The faculty had been paid in 3 years, so they were there out of necessity and nowhere else to go. In 5 years, the school went to 400 students from 22 states and 50 faculty. It was not called Washington College. It was called General Lee's College, because every one of those 400 students, from north as well as south, came to see and be part of the aura that was Robert E. Lee. And to an angry widow who complained of the future, Lee made that famous statement, "Madam, forget your animosities. Make your sons Americans." And he set his own pace from that. He would not write his memoirs. He's the only high-ranking Civil War figure who didn't, other than Lincoln, who was killed, of course, at the end of the war. He would not grant interviews. He would not make speeches. He would not attend veterans conventions. He would not be a part of monument dedications and things such as that. He would have been ashamed to see the Confederate battle flag waved in public as it has been for years now. And he would not want any sort of monument to his memory with him trying to bring the Union back together again, which is exactly why he needs to have those monuments done. Nobody else did as much as he did. And so, as I like to say to audiences, General Grant won the war, but General Lee saved the peace. And in 1870, it's kind of ironic if you read the newspaper of late, in 1870, he came home from an overly long vestry meeting at the Episcopal church he adored and suffered a fatal stroke and died 2 days later. And when he died, a nation mourned. And eulogies poured forth in editorials and letters and cards sent. And I've been at the W&L Library and read many of those eulogies. The one that impresses me the most came from, of all people, Julia Ward Howe. And she was the abolitionist lady who wrote the stirring lines to the most inspiring song of the Civil War, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And this woman from New England, an avowed abolitionist and professional Northerner, wrote this tribute. A gallant foeman in the fight, a brother when the fight was done, and so thy soldier grave beside, we honor thee, Virginia's son. Lee was 63 at his death. Grant was 63 at his death. Both generals wanted a bad war to be followed by a good peace. And Lee's decision spared the young nation from the horrors of a guerrilla war that would have forever prevented us from being together tonight, because we would not be a United States but for what he did after the war. You and I live in an age of politicians, not statesmen, an age of dissenters and mobsters rather than idealists and patriots. The lyrics in the theme song of the movie Walking Tall suddenly have new meaning, at least for me. Why can't we stand, join hand in hand? It's time to care, for we cannot wait and watch too long become too late. We've got to stop this nonsense that's going on. Our future depends on it. We search for modern-day heroes, and there are none. So for inspiration, we turn to history, the greatest teacher you will ever have. And when you turn to history, a noble Virginian appears. He served his state with a dedication not equaled by any figure who ever lived. We learn from the past so as to have confidence for the future. Robert Lee gives us courage. He led an army into legend and a United States into the dawn of a new day. And he did it all propelled by devotion to both duty and God. And nobody and no institution will ever change those incredible achievements. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.